QSO Today, episode 478, Don Westacott, VE6HQ. This episode of QSO Today is listener-sponsored. Only you can keep the QSO Today podcast coming to you every weekend since 2014. Please become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor banner on the show notes page or at the top of the QSOtoday.com webpage. Dominic, Nick Tusa, K5EF, my guest in episode 445, was inspired by my mentoring Akiva, the 9-year-old grandson of a friend of mine, towards his amateur radio license, with a donation of $750. Thanks, Nick. Additional donations this week were from Martin Bluestein, K1FQL, $100, and Steve Rice, W0SCR, $60. Dennis Ashworth, K7FL, is a new annual listener sponsor. There were other donations and sponsors who remained anonymous this week. I appreciate everything that everyone is doing to support the QSO Today podcast. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, amateur call sign 4Z1UG, where I demonstrate the diversity and relevance of the amateur radio hobby and its impact on society by interviewing ham radio operators, many of whom played vital roles in shaping our technology through the amateur radio hobby. And while many people might say, ham radio, do people still do that? This podcast demonstrates through in-depth interviews just how amazing, diverse, and dynamic the amateur radio hobby continues to be. Don Westacott, VE6HQ, believes that his early foundation in amateur radio contributed to his professional success through the multiple disciplines and the out-of-box thinking that is amateur radio. After a successful career and as an expert in subsurface measurements and remote sensing in the petroleum industry, Don now likes to work 20 meters and refine his test equipment bench using the latest low-cost solutions like the Nano VNA. VE6HQ is my QSO today. VE6HQ, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Don?
4Z1UG, this is VE6HQ. Eric, good evening. You are 5 by 9.
Good morning, Don. You are also 5 by 9. Thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Well, thank you, Eric. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to participate in a QSO Today podcast. I've listened to many, and it's very much an honor to be able to participate here today. So thank you.
Well, it's my pleasure, Don.
I guess taking a phrase from that great baseball coach and player Yogi Berra or Groucho Marx, I was born at a very young age, and what I mean by that is I started my interest in electronics and electricity really as young as I can remember. 5 or 6 years old, I found myself tinkering with electrical and electronic things. Now, this is back in the 50s, Eric, as you could appreciate. And, I guess my best memory that I can remember is building a audio transceiver and or a mono transceiver, one way. I have a twin brother, Douglas, also an amateur, and Doug and I found an old vacuum tube speaker, small speaker, maybe 3-inch in diameter, and a battery, and somehow we also found an old carbon microphone that was used in telephones at the time. Where we found them, Eric, it's been too many years. But with that battery and an extension cord that we had borrowed from our father's garage, we were able to kludge together a system that we could speak into this microphone, wired together through the battery, and actually hear voices on a speaker. And that was a major breakthrough with no instruction other than some basic inquisitiveness of both of us. We were able to make this system work. And that was a milestone, I think. In now at the time, we just were happy with ourselves, but it was a milestone, and we just grew from there. I remember as a youth in growing up in the basement of our home in Edmonton, in cold winter nights, as they still are in the winter, listening to a shortwave radio, an old shortwave radio, vacuum tube vintage, and having a whip antenna that was extended and a tuning knob that had maybe 2 megahertz of backlash associated with the tuning in it, or a large number. So you would have to carefully turn the knob to adjust the frequency, and listen to shortwave stations, and listen in awe of WWV coming in, and that tone of WV, and it really created an interest in science and technology and in radio that has carried me through my entire life, through my professional work, and especially through amateur radio.
Is he an identical twin?
Doug is an identical twin. We used to get so upset when people would call me Doug and call him Don.
They're so insensitive, aren't they?
They're so insensitive, don't they know? But of course, looking in a mirror, it's the same person.
I'm also an identical twin.
Oh, well, so you know the drill.
Right, and I hated being called the twins.
Yes, and you seem to be treated differently. I'm not trying to draw any sympathy at my age, but you seem to be treated differently than other people.
When you're a twin?
Yes.
The way that manifests itself as an adult is I'm very sensitive to twin children when adults refer to them as the twins, or which one are you, or which one of you is smarter.
Yes.
Aren't you the one that does blah? Aren't you the one? So my brother and I used to say, they'd say, well, you guys don't look the same. Whoever they were talking to, we would say, well, the other was deformed at birth. It's nice to have a twin brother that also follow your interest. Just out of curiosity, did you find another carbon microphone and speaker and make a telephone out of that system at some point?
Eric, we did not. Many people growing up in the 50s, we didn't have a lot of money and we didn't have a lot of resources. And we made do with what we had, and came up with very creative ways to, generate and continue this interest, and ultimately it turning into amateur radio operators at 15 years old. At that time, you could only be licensed when you were 15 in Canada.
So how did that happen? Did the two of you actually find books in the library, or did you have an Elmer or a mentor that kind of introduced you to ham radio?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question, Eric, about Elmers, and of course, we didn't have the term Elmer back then, but I think I had a lot of people that supported Douglas and myself, in our careers in amateur radio. I think first and foremost, and I'll talk about three, because three are really an important part. One, of course, was our father. Dad was, as they say in the U.S., a veteran. They don't use that term that commonly here in Canada. He landed in Normandy with a lot of the other young men with the Canadian Armed Forces, the Canadian Army at that time, and survived that and many other occurrences. Did not speak about the war that much, but his role was a radio man or radio officer, and that with the Canadian Signal Corps. And so he developed, his expertise during that role, and he sort of passed that on with not formal training, but just a very amount of guidance through that. his biggest guidance to me was the ability. Back in those days, you didn't buy things new like we do today, a planned obsolescence. Something breaks, you just throw it away and get a new one. You fixed everything. And if the washing machine broke, you didn't buy a new one, you fixed it. And Douglas and I were his helpers that learned electricity, learned mechanics, learned tools, fixing all the things, building a garage, wiring a garage, doing electrical work, pouring cement, all those life skills that are so important. We learned by, our great, and I believe it's different today. And that gave us and I've used those skills, through my entire life. The second one was our high school electronics teacher. I was in an academic program, but Mr. Marshall, Eric, I don't remember his call. It's more than 60 years ago, 55, I suppose. He was a ham. And I took electronics and it was wonderful. And he guided Doug and myself and encouraged us to get our amateur radio licenses. And the third person I never met, I never talked to, but I read about, I borrowed some QST magazines and there was an amateur that really, was a mentor to me. Again, I never met him. I did not know him, and I don't think I ever worked him. He lived in Hawaii. It was Katachi Nose, KH6IJ. And he was my hero. He had skills. He was doing things in technology. He was a fabulous DXer. And I looked up at him to say, I want to be just like Katachi Nose, a wonderful, famous, although I don't think Katachi ever thought of himself that way, honorable person that really promoted amateur radio. So those so those were three people that sort of guided me, and there were many others, but there were three people that guided myself into amateur radio. And I went down to the Department of Transport at that time, later to become the Department of Communications, later to become the Innovation, Science, and Economic Development Canada. So there's been a transformation over the years. And I knew the theory, and Doug and I practiced the code, and I went first. I was the older one, and I had the bravery to go in front. And that time, and I went in, and there was an examiner who was in his 40s or 50s, as I recall, and it was very frightening to be, having to take this test as a young person, and it was 10 words per minute code, and I passed the exam, and shortly after that, I was issued a license, and Doug, a few weeks later, went in, wrote his test, and also passed. So there we are in our beginnings of amateur radio as high school students in grade 10, and as they say, Eric, the rest is history.
Well, except you're going to have to tell some of that history. I'm curious, did amateur radio play a part in the choices that you made for your education and career after high school?
Eric, absolutely. Amateur radio was a foundation of my career choices. And not only that, I think of the successes that I enjoyed in my career, in my professional career. Amateur radio was a cornerstone of that. I first went and enrolled at the Northern Alberta Institute of Technology and got a degree in electronics technology, and enjoyed it. This was in the mid-'70s. Upon graduation, I thought, I'm doing pretty well at this. And I told my parents, I would like to go on to the University of Alberta, and continue my education in electrical engineering. And my father and my mother were very supportive of that. They believed very strongly in the value of education. And so I started a 4-year program and graduated with a degree in electrical engineering. And that was certainly a milestone for me as well.
So you actually started at the Northern Alberta Institute of Technology and you transferred to University of Alberta to finish your BSCE, or did you take a higher degree at the University of Alberta?
I got a Bachelor of Science in Electrical Engineering at the University of Alberta. There was nothing, I got a Diploma of Technology at NAIT, at the Institute of Technology. So there was really nothing at that time. The university did not really recognize the diploma. Now it's probably changed today.
Was that a more hands-on degree at the Institute of Technology?
Correct. You would be a more hands-on person. You would be working in a technical capacity, and that more than an engineering capacity. So there's just significantly different levels, but one flowed into another.
That prepared you to be a technician in a host of industries, including the electronics or power or something like that industries.
Absolutely. The NAIT, Northern Alberta Institute of Technology, operates today. They have a sister college in Calgary, the Southern Alberta, and the graduates in a multiple of disciplines are valued people in industry today, in electronics, in civil technology, in accounting services. I mean, you name it, a gamut of services, and they provide valuable training to the citizens, young people of this province and other provinces and in part across the world, foreign students also. So as do places of higher education like the University of Alberta, my alma mater.
Did Douglas follow you on a parallel track?
No. Much to my chagrin, or not my chagrin, but my parents' chagrin, especially my father, Doug decided to join the Canadian military and go into the Canadian Army, ultimately being accepted with 2 Commando, which is the Canadian Airborne Regiment. So it was an airborne commando, and had the opportunity to travel under the military regime and learn skills in the military regime, which most part were not directly transportable to the public domain. So, but that was because to fund our amateur radio acquisitions, our expenditures, and that we, as young adolescents, I always had a job. Always, when I was growing up. I mean, whether it was delivering flyers, paperwork, working as a delivery person in a drugstore, and that we also joined the Canadian militia. It's somewhat like the U.S. National Guard, and the Signal Corps to advance our 745 Communications Squadron in the Prince of Wales Arbories in Edmonton, we learned about radio, continued communications, and we got paid for it. So all these things were and this funded, because our family did not have a lot of money. I came from a large family. I had 6 brothers, including my twin brother Douglas, and so. Anything you got, you worked for yourself. It was just, those were the rules. And so And Doug really embraced the military style, and that's what he wanted to do. And that's what he did. And of course, now he's retired from the military and went back to school, earned a degree in technology, and is working in the communications field today. Well, it was two completely different life paths.
I think perhaps it's rare that identical twins actually follow the same paths exactly.
Yes, I would agree.
And now this mid-show break. The future of podcasting and the QSO Today podcast is listener sponsorship. It keeps us lean and focused on providing you the best ham radio interviews since 2014. You can keep the QSO Today podcast commercial and sponsor-free by becoming a listener sponsor yourself. For $10 a month or save 20% at $100 per year, you can become a listener sponsor. I am now recording the QSO Today podcast as video interviews that are available only as a benefit to listener sponsors through our QSO Today community website. As I develop the sponsorship tier, I will add bonus content for listener sponsors. Listener sponsors, not donors, are automatically members of the new QSO Today Academy. I am building the Academy website to include access to our Sequel.io networking lounges all of the time and Academy resources including over 400 previous Expo presentations with Q&A and additional helpful ham radio educational resources. The benefit of listener sponsorship as an alternative to commercial sponsorship is that commercial sponsors influence the content and comments in the podcast. Listener sponsorship allows a greater degree of freedom to discuss any ham radio subject without commercial consequence. I have eliminated all commercials in the QSO Today podcast from episode 445, with the exception of the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, as I think that this is a serious asset to a well-rounded ham radio education. I am not using Buy Me a Coffee or Patreon, but my own system for managing the community that could form out of the podcast. I direct you to the sponsorship section of the show notes pages beginning with the episode 444, where I list all of the contributors to the podcast since 2014, including sponsors, donors, and hams who have paid for transcriptions. If sponsorship is not your interest, then you can make any size donation to the podcast by clicking on the donation button on the QSO Today podcast website at qsotoday.com. There is a slider that you can use to adjust the amount of your donation. If you want to make your donation monthly, click on the recurring donation box. It is the recurring donations and the listener sponsorships that keep the lights burning here. Finally, you don't have to contribute anything to listen to the QSO Today podcast. You can use my Amazon affiliate link before shopping at Amazon by clicking on it on the right side of the show notes page. This will signal Amazon to send us a small percentage of what you purchase. This is the most painless way to ensure that the QSO Today project will be here next week. I want to thank everyone who has contributed and will contribute to my effort to create this oral history of amateur radio since 2014. It will eventually all be in the public domain for hams in the future to enjoy. Be sure to become a listener sponsor or make a donation today. And now we return to our QSO Today. So let me ask, what was the first rig that you and Douglas put together so that you could operate amateur radio from home?
Such great questions, Eric, and I jogged my memory, but the first rig was a Heathkit HR10B. That would be the first radio that I would say, yes, that is a true amateur radio, receiver that covered the amateur radio bands, was not a shortwave instrument, and we used that very effectively, well, at the time we thought, for making CWO contests in that first year, because in the first year you only had your amateur license, which was CW only on the HF bands. There was no phone privileges with that initial license. And so we ordered it from Heathkit. We built that radio in the basement with light bulb lamp and soldering iron and instruction and some guidance from our dad. on that, and put that radio together, and did the troubleshooting, because in business or in amateur, nothing quite works exactly the first time, and so that brought up skills to make it work, and that was our HR10B.
So that was the receiver.
That was the receiver, Eric. Yes, the transmitter. As I recall, we knew of a gentleman, Gene Crable, VE6 Texas Papa, a very famous DXer, lived in Edmonton, and he owned a radio store, or had part of a radio store in downtown Edmonton. And he would get used radios and then, of course, resell them. So he was sort of like the eBay of the time, as it were, that amateurs would buy something new. And he had a dream transmitter, and Holocrafters HT44, as I call it. It was an HT44. It was Holocrafters, not a Hammerman. It was Holocrafters. I'm dating myself. When you say Holocrafters Hamlin, you're going back a few years, I'm sure. And so we got this, and that was our transmitter. And we sort of kludged together the HR10B and the HT44. And put I remember a Dow key relay for transmit and receive, and learned about these principles of and then hooked it up to a dipole antenna, and we started off, and we grew from there on our system. Ultimately, and I look back, and I sometimes wonder how we did this. I mean, we had our jobs, we had our school, and we seemed to pour all our energy into ham radio for learning, for doing, and we ultimately wound up with an R4B, a TX4B, and an L4B amplifier, which were at that time, Eric, were like the primo amateur radio station of the day.
We call that the Drake line.
The Drake line, the Drake 4 line. So we had the Drake 4 line, and to use an American term, we were in high cotton. We were, and I remember and of course we were not more than kids back then. I remember other amateurs that had a wife and a family and a mortgage and just not having that type of equipment, but in deference to ourselves, Doug and I, we worked for that and put our own resources into that. We had a lot of fun.
Well, you had double the money and the power, right?
We had double the money and the power.
That was a rig to die for in those days. It was the poor man's Collins S line, right?
It was the poor man's Collins S line, and that, and so we had, and I was working phone. 20 Meters was my favorite band, and 20 Meters even today is my favorite band. You know how we get our favorites for whatever reason, and so, and then following that, a friend of mine, another amateur, Gordon Reed, VE6HQ in Edmonton, he was interested in VHF and UHF, not 2 meter FM work, but that type of communication. So I thought, well, this is interesting, and so I started building 432 megahertz equipment, a 70 centimeter CW and sideband equipment, and that one of the reading the ARRL handbook, the antenna handbook, Bill Orr's handbook, which I still have today. It was the Bible, the gospel to me. It was a great source of information, and I'd read that and said, well, I'm going to build, and ultimately ended up building a coaxial cavity 4CX 250 amplifier, home brew. You could home brew back in those days. It's changed a bit today, and we'll talk about that a little later. And built equipment, and had a transmitter or down converter that would go into the 28 megahertz on the Drake 4B, and ultimately put together an antenna system, and then did what I would consider a first, certainly first for us, where people were talking locally on 2 meters FM. Another great mentor that helped me, again, I never met him directly, was Andy Malinchuk, who lived in Calgary, was a radio engineer, and also a very individual was interested in VHF and UHF communications. And somehow I contacted Andy, and he encouraged me to set up an antenna system so we could experiment with over-the-horizon tropospheric scatter between Edmonton and Calgary, which is a distance of 300 kilometers. And so with this amplifier and some coax and some Yagi antennas, we were able to communicate back and forth any time of the day, 24 hours a day. We had a path loss of about 200 decibels between us, in other words, 10 to the minus 20 between our two QTHs. And it was groundbreaking. It was, today it's no big deal, but back then it was very, very significant.
Why do you say that, Don? I'm just curious. You're relying on the troposphere. Obviously, you were young.
Yes.
It was new to you, but you created this reliable communications link over that path.
Yes.
And I think you just said it worked all the time.
Yes.
Obviously, the troposphere had to be there. I saw this. I made a note to myself that I should ask you about this, and so you've brought this up. Do you think that there was some unique attribute of the troposphere above Canada because you were going east-west at that time or something like that?
We were going north-south.
But for it to be there all the time, do you think that was...
Tropospheric scatter is much more understood today than it was back, in the early 70s. People have noticed that radio wave propagation over the horizon didn't fall off at for VHF and UHF waves at the same rate that more line of sight would indicate, and they attributed that to slight. The troposphere is not totally homogeneous. In other words, there are different refractive indices due to differences in water content throughout the troposphere, which is just above the atmosphere. It's up 10 kilometers and so these slight different indices of refraction will tend to scatter a VHF or UHF radio wave, so that portions like a headlight in fog will be scattered and diffused. That same scattering phenomena will apply to UHF frequencies. And communications companies were starting to use this for instance, offshore and long-haul communications, and starting to introduce this technology. So amateur radio operators became aware of this communications method and started building systems in the U.S. So I wasn't inventing something new. I was just a young person with the cooperation from Andy, just sort of replicating something and pioneering it, as it were, at least I thought I was, in the province of Alberta. So for me, it was a really a personal accomplishment. And I wrote in my final year of university, they wanted a paper produced, and I wrote about this. It's, hey, let's do a project that I've already got done, right? Same time. and wrote about this and went into more of the math of it and that. And unfortunately, Andy passed away just as we were, having this working extremely well, and he passed away. I, really appreciate him. His son, Barry Malinchuk, who lives V4MA, who lives in Winnipeg, is also carried on like his father and is a fabulous UHF EME. He holds many records for his accomplishments in EME and long distance UHF communications. And I speak with him with email from time to time, but I look with great fondness of having the ability to communicate with Andy and having that milestone in my career, because it was all hand built and just an idea that worked and with an incomplete understanding at the time of actually what we were doing.
Is there a lesson from that whole project that kind of sums up something that you could give to us in terms of what that was all about?
The lesson for me was, don't be afraid to try something just because you don't understand it at the beginning. Try it, explore, be inquisitive in your life, use logic and reasoning and experimentation and I believe it gives you further insight and a great sense of accomplishment. And I think that is one of the foundations of amateur radio. We're all inquisitive. We are all learners. We all want to explore something new in this great adventure we call amateur radio, and it binds us and bonds us together. And so I think it's important to continue that mindset, through our professional careers and also this wonderful, wonderful hobby of amateur radio. I hope that answers your question, Eric.
It does, actually. You made a presentation at the QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo in August of 2021 about time and frequency. And I'm just wondering, do you have an interest that you've developed in precision instruments for ham radio?
Yes, I do. Most of my professional career, you could coin it as remote sensing. I was in the energy sector and in the oil and gas industry, both here in North America and worldwide. And my expertise, if you could call that, and I'm still learning, was petroleum physics, where we would take instrumentation. Instead of sending it to the moon or the Mars, we would send it to the subsurface and take measurements in the subsurface and bring those measurements back and conduct analysis of those measurements. And so from that, we would gain insight into what was below the surface, and that ability to make measurements and experimentation and has carried through my entire career. And right now I like conducting measurements. I'm building my own little mini lab that and you can buy all sorts of instrumentation today at very low cost versus what we were doing back in the 50s and 60s. To buy a vector network analyzer back in when I was a youth was $30,000, $40,000, $50,000. Now we can have a pretty good vector network analyzer off of Amazon for $100.
Right, on a Raspberry Pi or something like that, right?
And running on a Raspberry Pi. So the age of microcomputers and computers. So I've built a little laboratory here where I look at things like time and frequency stability and instrumentation and building up this technology. If I could say, my second presentation to QSO today about how do we build on instrumentation and do it cost effectively. Because I don't have another 50 years, I don't believe, to put into amateur radio with my current age bracket. But I would like to get instrumentation that gives me quantitative measurements cost effectively. And I'm finding there are many, many just ways to do that are so satisfying. And I really enjoy tinkering and learning. And just to further about that, one of my great passions is geodesy. And geodesy is not geology, although I was associated with that. Geodesy is looking at the size, shape, and positions of points on this Earth, or you could extend it to positions anywhere in the universe. And it's all about making a map, making maps, and that was again a fairly large part of my career. Taking information and looking at a map view or a 3D distribution of petrophysical properties, oil and gas properties in the subsurface, and so that became a really learning exercise. And it turns out that understanding position and map making is kind of joined at the hip with precise time measurements, measuring time. And that because I look back to the age of Harrison. John Harrison was a carpenter, an amateur clockmaker in England in the 1700s. And he invented a very accurate marine chronometer that could measure time, keep time very precisely, and from that solve the problem of measuring longitude at sea for the position of ships, which was critically important at that time. And through some work, it's a fascinating history. One of my great pleasures in life was climbing that hill in Greenwich, just outside of London, in Greenwich, climbing the hill to the Greenwich Royal Observatory and seeing an H4 chronometer, a timepiece, this massive watch in the museum at Greenwich, and it was a milestone to visit that and see that wonderful invention of keeping time. Today, we have GPS satellite timekeepers that we get time, on our computers so that we can communicate with these new digital protocols like FT8 that is ubiquitous in amateur radio, that have brought to us by wonderful people like Joe Taylor and others that have brought this technology forward. So it's been an interest of mine for a number of years.
And what's on your workbench? I'm looking at a beautiful office room right now on our screen here.
Yes.
But that doesn't look like where the work is done. Is the work done there, or do you have a workshop?
Both. I have a workshop out back, a wonderful workshop out back, quite spacious, that I do construction and drilling and that for these projects. But I also have a small test bench table here. And right now, I've constructed a little RF signal generator that goes from, has a frequency coverage from 40 megahertz up to 4.4 gigahertz. Yes, it covers all the I'm interested in the UHF, the SHF frequency bands. And so right now I'm testing this and looking at what is the accuracy and stability of this measure. So I'll conduct tests over 24 or 48 hours and measuring the frequency accuracy and the stability. Now, back in the day when I started, with my HR10B and the plug-in crystal calibrator, we thought we were doing fabulous. 1 part per million stability, was like nirvana. If you could get 1 part per million on your radio, that was like 10 hertz at 10 megahertz, like that was the end of the rainbow. You have got to the pot of gold for that kind of stability. Now, at this little thing using a GPS discipline oscillator and an SDR radio, I'm monitoring this particular RF signal generator, which, by the way, I purchased from Amazon for $100. This little tiny little board, and that, I mean, it's that 50 years ago, well, first of all, you couldn't buy that device. I mean, it would have been a fortune. It would have been, and today it's that. And now I'm saying, well, man, I'm looking at a tenth or a hundredth of a hertz resolution, just like that with the measurements. I'm seeing the drift at 432 megahertz. I'm seeing it drifting 1 or 2 cycles, which is, 2/10 of or 2/100ths of a part per million. And I'm thinking, oh, that's too much. That'll never do. I've got to correct this. I've got to build in a GPS discipline oscillator to train the local oscillator to reduce this drift, this thermal drift, down to maybe a part per billion. It's amazing, Eric.
I think, Don, that I'm just going to have you do another presentation for the expo in the spring, where you're talking about your RF signal generator. Now, is this RF signal generator, is it front-ended with a USB? I mean, are you using your computer as an interface to this device to be able to program it and run it?
Yes. And let me expand on that question. Everything that I do in amateur radio today, I like to put it through my computer system. If it's a piece of test equipment or a piece of radio equipment, it's all connected to my computers. I wouldn't say I was a geek, but my wife would.
But she always knows where you are, Don, right?
But yes, she does. She does know where I'm. But what is so fascinating to me with amateur radio today is the interconnectivity between what we do on the HF or VHF or UHF bands and our computers and the marvelous technology associated with the internet. I've really have been attracted to, for instance, the FT8 systems, where I can communicate with people and exchange messages and see that on my computer screen using things like PSK Reporter. Who am I talking to? Who's using me? Now, I realize, Eric, speaking with people, that FT8 and other digital modes have some controversy today. That some of us think, well, that's not really ham radio. We're not having the microphone and the dials. But to me, I think we need to, as amateur radio operators, embrace change. Amateur radio today is so diverse. There are so many countless areas that we can get into. And I think that is a very positive part of amateur radio. If you don't like digital communications, there is 100 other, you don't care for it today, there's 100 other areas: public service, satellite communication, FM receivers, emergency radio systems, rag-chew nets. I mean, the list is, lengthy. And so I think this is one of the draws for amateur radio to me, is there's so much to learn. I'm just fascinated by all the things that I can get into. There are so many rabbit holes to chase.
I want to take a minute to tell you about my favorite podcast, the Ham Radio Workbench Podcast, with George, KJ6VU, and now joined by Rod, VA30N, Mike, VA3MW, Mark, N6MTS, and Vince, VE6LK. Every 2 weeks, George and company offer up a status report on the many amateur radio projects on their workbenches and explore projects on their guests' workbenches. This group is project active and prolific, covering many technical areas of amateur radio. So the next time you want a deep dive into ham radio electronic project building, or to learn about technology, tools, test equipment, construction techniques, and the rest, listen to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, available on every podcast player and channel. Use the link in this week's show notes page to get to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast directly. And now back to my QSO. You may recall I did an interview in July of this year, episode 459, with Bo Amber, K6EAU, And Bo was a relatively new ham. At least at that point, I hadn't really interviewed very many hams that had only been licensed for just a few years. But he brought something to my attention that's amateur radio that I would never have thought of, and perhaps nobody else thought of, but he kind of made it an amateur radio thing. And that was he hunts weather balloon transmitters that are launched every morning. His exercise is to get up at 4 or 5 in the morning to be around when they launched a weather balloon from the local airport, and then he'd go look for it. But then he'd retask those transmitters when he found them, put them in the amateur bands to use them as amateur transmitters for projects that he had. They were programmable, all that stuff. And I thought, what a clever idea that people are coming up to make this amateur radio. But sometimes we need brand new blood that comes in and kind of looks at our hobby and breaks all the rules, at least the rules that we thought were the rules.
Eric, I could not agree with you more. Recently, I communicated through email with Rick Roderick, K5UR, who's the president of the ARRL. I'm a member of ARRL, RAC, Radio Amateur Canada, Quarter Century, the local club here in Central Alberta Radio Association. And I heard Rick talk at the Halifax annual general meeting of the Radio Amateurs of Canada. And Rick was an invited guest representing the ARRL. And Rick was speaking. I was listening to the webcast, and he mentioned that we need to embrace change in amateur radio. He speaks to a lot of youth in his tours, high schools, etc. And he was telling the group in Halifax that he held up an HT and said, by the way, I can speak to people all around the world on this. And he indicated the story that a student held up an iPhone and said, Mr. Roderick, I can speak to people around the world on this too. And so we need to rethink how we package and present what we do in amateur radio. It's not just, talking on 20-meter sideband HFDX, which is great. I love it, and making contacts. But it's radio balloons. It's talking to the International Space Station. It's doing Aries and public service work at foot races. It's doing things like SOTA, Summits on the Air, and Parks on the Air that's in embracing nature and amateur radio communications. Our diversity today is amateur radio's strength, and we need to really amplify that there is a niche for everyone. Like, I am not climbing SOTAs. We have an amateur here in Red Deer, Paul Mower. And Power Mower, he's a mountain goat.
Yes, he was my guest. He's crazy, that guy. He's a mountain goat. He goes by himself out into the snow in the mountain, the Rocky Mountains.
Rocky Mountains and summer, spring, fall. There's, right now, that's just not. I could do it once, and that would be it. I'd be, I couldn't survive that rigor. But those kind of things are amazing to me and shows the strength and breadth of amateur radio, and what a wonderful hobby. And it's been more than a hobby to me. It has really influenced and being an underpinning of my professional career. Working around the world and in field operations, and that either as, that things didn't often work exactly the way that you thought they would work in things. Things go wrong. And the ability to look at things technically and do good problem solving and move the process forward and be able to communicate with people, many of different parts of this world, and come to common ground was an essential part of what I believe was my successful career. And I enjoyed what I did. I had the opportunity to do some very novel and exciting things. I had the opportunity to invent and patent new technology with some new ideas, and so it was fun. It was fun for me, but unfortunately, it sort of kept me out of amateur radio. And it was only when I retired to say, okay, well, what do I want to do next? And I thought, well, maybe I get back into ham radio. But I was concerned, does it still exist anymore? Do people really do ham radio? We were living in the U.S. at the time, and I found out, my goodness, it is not only alive, it's blossomed. There's 700,000 amateur radio operators licensed in the U.S. Now, certainly not them all active. Some days I say, thankfully, we got all on the air. It'd be like chaos. But, and so I decided, okay, I'm going to get back into this because I don't do any golfing anymore. And what's going to, my biggest fear of being retired is I'd be bored. And for those people, I found quite the opposite. I don't have enough time to do all the things that I want to do now that I'm retired.
So, Don, let me ask you something. I'm just curious because I see you were doing something with nuclear magnetic resonance.
Yes.
Which is like, I think MRI machines derive from that technology, right?
It's the same technology.
But you use it in the geological sphere. And I'm just curious, how successful were you with that? Does it have anything to do with what we're doing here in Israel, where we're actually finding tunnels with equipment like this that's pinging down into the ground and finding tunnels?
Nuclear magnetic resonance is a well-accepted technology within the oil and gas exploration sector. And I had a small part of moving that process forward, a small part, as does many, many others. But what has emerged in the U.S. and has expanded globally is unconventional reservoirs. These so-called shale plays that have been prolific in the U.S. and in Canada and emerging in other nations. They're really not shales; they're more properly organic, rich mudstones. And it turns out that all the technology in petroleum physics was built or focused to analyze conventional reservoirs, sandstones, carbonate reservoirs, limestones, dolomites, and were challenged to identify the properties of these organic rich mudstones, of these shale plays. They didn't give, clear results. It was muddy, basically. So myself and a few others had the idea to adapt nuclear magnetic resonance that looks at the hydrogen proton, the hydrogen, that exists in a water molecule, that exists in an oil molecule. Oil is a hydrocarbon, hydrogen and carbon, as water is H2O. So it's able to ping these, I lack of a better word, and look at the population of these hydrogen protons in the subsurface. Most rocks don't contain hydrogen. The fluids in the rocks contain hydrogen. So I had the idea that I said, okay, I was working for a independent oil and gas company, that I was going to run the nuclear magnetic log in a number of shale plays that I was associated with, that we were exploring. The response was from the service companies actually supplied this instrumentation was, well, Don, it doesn't work. Everybody knows that, it works great in conventional, it doesn't work and I thought, well, maybe we just look at it a different way. So I looked at great expense, called them out, and of course they were happy to do it, and ran the instrumentation and looked at the data and processed the data and said, aha, I'm just going to change some parameterization, how we look at this data. And now, today, through this work, and it's funny once you have a good idea how many people buy into it and glom it to their own, but it doesn't matter to me. It has become an accepted standard worldwide of applying this technology and others to evaluation of these reservoirs, and gives, I believe, great insight into the economic productivity of hydrocarbons from this type of rock facies. So I was very happy about that, and published on it, and that we could readapt the technology, reuse it, just change our mindset a little bit, and make it work.
Do you think that is an amateur radio mindset applied to this problem?
I totally believe that. I think my amateur radio experience of being continuously confronted with problems, technical problems, and being able to solve them really, propelled my thinking as a professional engineer and in petroleum physics. We were always confronted with these technical problems. So I think it's a great opportunity, and that's why I think amateur radio to get into is, for me, it was the right choice, and we should look at it that way. It's basically propels us into, potentially a very meaningful career and satisfaction. At least that's been my experience. So I'm very happy.
I had a neighbor who's been meaning to come over the last year or so, who has a beautiful wood shop. He has a metal shop. He can weld anything, 3 different kinds of welders, gas, electric arc, this stuff. He's a real builder. He has an electronic problem, and he caught me while I'm walking the dog the other day, and I said, well, come over to the shop and let me see if I can fix this thing for you. For me, it wasn't a big deal. Getting the screws off, that was a little challenging, but I had the tools, taking the things apart. I have my desolder sucker, which is a vacuum device I bought on eBay. I have all my tools and stuff. And he saw me working, and he said, I've never seen someone work like you. And I'm thinking, what does that mean? He says, everything is part of what you are. You're integrated with the equipment. And I said, well, thank you. That's a very nice thing for you to say. So he actually puts out a thing to the city, Eric can fix anything. I'm waiting for people to bust down the door that I'm supposed to be fixing all kinds of things. But I'm saying it's the amateur radio for 50 years and the hours holding the light for my father when he was working on the cars or the wood shop or the metal shop or whatever. As a kid, it creates this. And I'm sure that I'm speaking for many of the listeners who have similar abilities that were developed over time just because of all of the things we have to do in amateur radio. Again, I think that any of us who have been in the hobby for so long and are used to putting our fingers into the work know that we could probably do just about anything, or we know the resources to find in order to finish the job.
Eric, that is so true. That is so true. If I could say amplify that or bounce it back, in my final year of university, all us young men in the graduating class were looking for gainful employment. That I wasn't. It wasn't in the cards to go on to get a master's degree. I'd gone through technical school. I'd gone through graduated university. I was graduating that year. Employment was on the screen. I was sort of encouraged from the parents' point of view, have
to pay back.
Yeah, you get the pay back. Yeah, exactly. There's no free lunch, and so and in those days, and today they have career fairs, at the university. So I was walking along and looking, and there's a company. I don't recognize the name, but I recognize the logo. There's a logo there. Well, that's the same. And my aspiration, I was going to get into space communication, ground stations, RF communication, which is just emerging at that time, Telecom Canada. And so I recognized the logo. Well, that's the same logo as Heathkit. Okay. So where's the forms? Fill out the form, name, information, phone number, and little did I know, the company that I had just signed up for was an oil field service company. And the next thing I knew, I was basically hired on the spot because in '77 they were, it was booming, and it's a boom to bust cycle in the energy sector, and this was a boom time. So if you had two arms, you were good enough to go,
and a breath.
And a breath. You were, and so the next thing I found myself was in a vehicle heading up high level Alberta, way up north in Alberta, as a junior wireline field engineer, which the job encompassed. You basically had a mobile laboratory. It was a big truck filled with 14,000 feet of electric cable, steel cable and electrical conductors, 7 conductors in the interior, where you'd lower instrumentation down a well bore, an oil and gas well, and you would make measurements and collect this data. Well, back in the 70s, it was a job that you would drive for hours and hours, 12, 14 hours driving straight. These were different days back then. You would arrive at a well site filled with mud, cold, blowing snow, poor visibility. You would assemble equipment. You would always have problems. The equipment was pounded over these roads to death, and things would break. You would start the operation, and you didn't sleep till the operation was done. 24 to 36 hours later, you might be finished if everything went smoothly. You didn't get stuck in the hole. You didn't bridge off. There's 1,000 things going wrong as you dip this instrument, this steel pipe loaded with technology. So why I'm telling this story is the ability to troubleshoot, to repair, to use these skills that I acquired in electronics and ham radio was instrumental in my survival as a operating field engineer, and I was later transferred to southwestern Ontario and did offshore Lake Erie and all through Canada, the Canadian Arctic, and then worked up the totem pole, as it were, from there to office and then into oil and gas exploration companies. But I remember one particular incident of a critical failure when we were doing a well just north of Maine in Quebec. We had traveled all the way from London, Ontario to Quebec, about 800 miles of travel before getting to location. And it was 3 people, 3-man crew, myself as the engineer and 2 operators as technical assistants. And we got there and started putting pieces of equipment together and realized one piece of equipment was broken. And so the operator, been a great friend, said, well, Don, I guess we're going to have to hot shot, get a new piece of equipment to replace this broken one. And we're standing there, and I looked over at Al, and I said, Al, we're in the middle of nowhere. I said, the nearest location is St. John's, an island out or Edmonton. These guys are ready for us now. The oil company was ready for, and time is money. And I said, well, we need to fix this, And so I literally cut apart equipment and soldered and spliced and made and jumpered. And the guys were looking at me and thinking, Don, you're nuts. And put this piece of equipment together and checked it on surface, lowered down 12,000 feet, brought it back to surface. Everything worked perfectly. And it was that ability to fix and repair things, not only in that instance, but many instances, really helped the organization that I was working for, our entire team. So I'm sorry to give you this kind of out of space.
No, it's a great story. Do you think that your company recognized the value of this experience as amateur radio?
No, to answer that question, no, I don't think I ever said, well, I'm an amateur radio operator, because I sort of was getting out of that field because we were working these incredible long hours. And when I get home after 2 weeks, all I wanted to do is rest and sleep and recharge. But it was recognized within the organization, that here's a young field engineer that can actually fix things and is working more independent rather than having the base continuously support him, because it costs a lot of money and time to send out replacement equipment and that from time to time.
You're kind of a MacGyver.
Kind of a MacGyver. Now I can tell you there's been instances that things didn't quite fix the way I wanted to do them, and that we always have our successes and failures.
But you weren't afraid to try.
Eric, exactly right. I wasn't afraid to try something and to try something new, whether it was nuclear magnetic resonance or fixing things in the field, or, when I went into my, let's say office and managerial role to invent new technology. And I'm particularly proud of actually inventing and patenting brand new technology. We were faced with a challenge, at least I thought we were faced with a challenge of these shale plays, these unconventional reservoirs, to try to analyze what fluids were in that rock. And so we had a process of bringing rocks to surface called coring, which has been around 100 plus years, taking a rock sample, bringing it to surface, looking at the rocks. The challenge was all the fluids in the rock would disappear because you're releasing the pressure as you bring it to surface. And so all the fluids would drain out. And it's the fluids that interest you that you want. So I came up with this brainstorm, which was not well accepted at first. Why don't we go down and take the sample of rock and put it in a pressure vessel that holds the rock and the fluids, seal it down whole, bring it back to surface, send it to the lab, open it up under controlled conditions, and actually analyze what fluids are in the rock. And I called it, and so through some work and some persistence, we were able to, and others that helped in this whole process, many others but some key individuals that made this work. And it is a commercial service. I hold a number of patents on the technology, and it really has given us insight, I believe, into better analysis of the most important part of the reservoir, the fluids that are in them. So, and it was just an idea, and I said, well, why not? Let's give it a try. What's the worst you can do? Fail. People have, and maybe it's instilled in us that failure is bad. I had the distinct honor to work for an oil and gas company in Calgary and being mentored by John Allen Masters. John was a legend in the oil and gas business. He was honored with the gold medal of the AAPG, the Association of Exploration Geologists and Geophysicists in the U.S. And one of the things he told all of us in the oil and gas exploration business was, don't be afraid to fail, because exploration, whether it's offshore Israel or in the northern Alberta, there's failure and risks are associated. You don't know everything for sure in life and in the subsurface. Mother Nature does not just set out a textbook to say, here's the way it is. There are unknowns. And so this ability to look at a problem and not be afraid of failure, balance the risks and the rewards and proceed, is that. And so whether it's constructing a UHF 70 centimeter tropospheric communication system as a young person, or, conducting measurements with an Arduino computer to power this RF signal generator. And I know nothing about Arduinos, and I know even less about writing Arduino scripts. But you can always learn, and that's what makes it great.
No matter how old you are.
No matter how old or young you are. It makes no difference. Your gender, your age, all it takes is, and I believe we all have it, the inner motivation, the curiosity to explore, to discover in this great hobby of amateur radio. I think that's what drives us all.
Don, this is a wonderful place to end. It's a very high note. I want to thank you so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast and wish you 73. And I hope that I work you on something sometime soon. In the meantime, what a pleasure it was. Thank you so much.
Eric, it was a distinct pleasure. I think you and the QSO Today organization do such great work for the amateur radio community, promoting it, distributing information, and I am honored to participate today in this podcast. So thank you very much.
73.
73. Thank you, Eric.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Don. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in VE6HQ in the search box at the top of the page. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any of the episodes into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing on the subscribe buttons on the show notes page. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes pages. Your value for value support is recognized on the QSO Today podcast and in the weekly show notes. Use our Amazon link when you shop on Amazon. Clicking on this link before you enter Amazon will allow Amazon to pay us a small commission on what you purchase. This is a very painless way to support the QSO Today podcast. QSO Today is syndicated on every podcast platform, including Spotify and the iTunes Store. Until next time, this is Eric 4Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.